The hospital hallway was so quiet that Maria Bennett could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock above the nurses' station. Tick, tick, tick. Each second felt heavier than the last. The bright white lights reflected off the polished floor, making everything feel cold and distant, like the world had suddenly become a place without warmth. Maria sat in a stiff chair outside the intensive care unit, her hands trembling as she clutched a small, worn sneaker in her lap. It belonged to her son Ethan. Just hours earlier, that boy had been laughing. Now, machines were breathing for him behind the glass doors. Doctors moved quickly, their voices low and urgent. Tubes and monitors surrounded the thin body of the 13-year-old boy who had once believed that every stranger in the world had a little kindness in their heart. Mary's chest tightened as she stared through the window. How Ethan, her sweet boy, the same boy who used to split his only sandwich with another homeless man, the same boy who waved at every passing car like the world was still full of friends he hadn't met yet. And now the doctors were saying he wouldn't survive the night. A nurse approached slowly, her expression gentle but heavy with the kind of sympathy Maria had begun to fear. Mrs. Bennett, she said softly, the doctors need to speak with you. Maria stood on shaky legs as she followed the nurse down the hallway. Inside the consultation room, 3 doctors waited. Their faces told the story before they even spoke. Dr. Harris cleared his throat, his voice careful. We've done everything we can, he said quietly. But Ethan has severe internal bleeding and traumatic injuries. His body is shutting down. Maria felt like the air had been ripped from her lungs. No, she whispered. No, you're wrong. He's strong. My boy is strong, but deep inside. She already knew the truth. Her son was dying. The room blurred as tears filled her eyes. And then, suddenly, a memory flashed through her mind. A little girl, bright eyes, a cheerful wave from a car window. Sophie Whitmore, the sick child, whose mother used to stop by their corner with food, the child who needed a heart transplant. Maria slowly looked up at the doctors, her face wet with tears. Her voice trembled as she asked a question that made the entire room fall silent. If my son isn't going to make it, she swallowed painfully. Could his heart save someone else? The doctors exchanged stunned glances. Are you asking about organ donation? One of them said gently. Maria nodded, her voice breaking. There's a little girl here, Sophie Whitmore. She's been waiting for a heart for a moment. Nobody spoke. Then Dr. Harris said something that would change everything. We can run the tests. But a match like that would be extremely rare. Maria closed her eyes and whispered something that no mother should ever have to say. Please check. Hours later, the results came back. Against all odds, it was a perfect match. In that moment, Maria Bennett faced the most heartbreaking decision any parent could imagine. Let her son slip away into silence, or allow his heart to keep beating inside another child. What happened next would move an entire nation to tears. But before we continue this story, let me ask you something. What would you do if you were in Maria's place? Could you find the strength to make such a sacrifice? I'd really love to hear your thoughts, so tell me in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, please consider subscribing. These stories take a lot of time, care, and heart to bring to life, and your support truly means everything. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of this unforgettable story. Long before the cold hospital walls and the heartbreaking decision that would define her life, Maria Bennett and her son Ethan had already been fighting a battle most people would never understand. Every morning, before the city of Chicago fully woke up, Maria would gently shake her son awake beneath the thin blanket they shared. Ethan, hey buddy, she would whisper softly. Morning's here. The boy would blink his sleepy eyes open, his breath forming tiny clouds in the chilly air. The alley behind the old grocery store where they slept was never warm, especially during the colder months. But Ethan rarely complained. Not at 13 years old. He had already learned a difficult truth about life. Sometimes you just had to keep going. Maria would help him fold their one blanket while the city slowly came alive around them. Cars began humming in the distance. Buses roared through early traffic, and somewhere nearby a CAF opened its doors, letting the smell of fresh coffee drift into the street. They would gather their few belongings into a faded backpack before making the short walk to the corner, where they spent most of their days. It was a busy intersection. Thousands of cars passed through it every day. For most drivers, Maria and Ethan were just another sad image in the city. 2 homeless people holding a cardboard sign. Invisible. But if anyone ever stopped long enough to really look, they would see something unusual. Maria Bennett still carried herself with quiet dignity, and Ethan still smiled. The cardboard sign he held wasn't angry or demanding. It simply read, "Trying to get back on our feet. Anything helps. Thank you." Sometimes people rolled their windows down and handed them a few dollars. Sometimes someone would offer a sandwich, and many times, people simply looked away. Some drivers avoided eye contact completely, pretending they hadn't noticed the boy standing just feet away from their car. Others weren't as kind. Maria had heard every insult imaginable. Get a job. You're probably lying. Stop using your kid for sympathy. Each word cut deeply. But Maria had learned to keep her composure, because every time someone said something cruel, Ethan would glance at her, silently asking the same question with his eyes. Are we okay in MOM? And Maria would always give him the same reassuring smile. Yes, we're okay. What most strangers never knew was that Maria had once worked two jobs. Years earlier, life had looked very different. Back then, she lived in a small apartment with her husband Daniel and their little boy. Daniel had been a construction worker, strong, hard-working, and proud of the life they were building. But one terrible day, an accident at the job site took Daniel's life. The loss shattered Maria's world. Medical bills, funeral costs, and rising rent slowly swallowed everything she had saved. She worked endless hours trying to stay afloat. But eventually, the number stopped adding up, and one winter morning, an eviction notice appeared on their door. Maria never forgot the day. Ethan carried their belongings out of that apartment. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Yet through all of it, Ethan had remained the same kind-hearted boy he had always been. In fact, sometimes Maria felt like he was the one keeping her strong. One afternoon, a few months after they had begun living on the streets, a man named Carl, a homeless veteran who slept near their corner, had gone 2 days without eating. Maria was trying to figure out how to divide the single sandwich someone had given them earlier before she could say anything. Ethan quietly walked over and handed the whole sandwich to Carl. Maria had watched in surprise. But Ethan, that was your lunch, she said. The boy simply shrugged. He looked hungrier than me. Moments like that made Maria both proud and heartbroken at the same time. Despite everything life had taken from him, Ethan still believed in kindness, and that kindness didn't go unnoticed by everyone. Among the thousands of cars that passed their intersection, one vehicle always slowed down, a silver SUV driven by a woman named Laura Whitmore. The first time she stopped, Maria assumed it would be like most encounters, quick and distant, but Laura surprised her. Instead of simply handing over money, she passed Maria a small bag. Inside were sandwiches, juice boxes, and 2 warm muffins for you and your son, Laura said kindly. Beside her in the passenger seat sat a little girl with bright brown eyes and curly hair. She leaned across the console and waved enthusiastically. Hi. Ethan's face lit up immediately. He waved back, a shy grin spreading across his face. Hi. From that day forward, whenever Laura drove through the intersection, she slowed down. Sometimes she brought food, sometimes just a few dollars, but she always brought kindness. And her daughter, Sophie, never forgot to wave at Ethan. Over time, those small moments became something Maria and Ethan quietly looked forward to each morning. It reminded them that not everyone in the world had forgotten how to care. But one afternoon, something changed. Laura pulled over to the curb instead of simply stopping at the light. When Maria approached the car, she immediately noticed the sadness in Laura's eyes. Something was wrong, and the conversation that followed would unknowingly set the stage for the heartbreaking events that were about to unfold. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced kindness from a complete stranger during a difficult moment in your life? Sometimes even the smallest act of kindness can mean everything. If you have a story like that, I'd really love to hear it. Tell me about it in the comments. The busy intersection where Maria and Ethan spent their days sat along one of the endless arteries of Chicago, place where thousands of people passed by every hour, each person carrying their own worries, plans, and destinations. But for Maria and her son, that corner wasn't just a traffic stop. It was survival, day after day. Maria stood beside Ethan holding their one cardboard sign while the city rushed past them. Some days were kind, but many days were not. On cold mornings, drivers sometimes rolled down their windows just long enough to throw insults instead of coins. Stop using your kid to beg. Get off the street. You're probably scamming people. Maria had learned to keep her face calm when she heard those words, but Ethan still felt them. One afternoon, A man in an expensive black sedan stopped at the red light directly in front of them. Maria stepped forward carefully, offering a polite smile as she always did. Before she could speak, the man sneered. "You're teaching that kid to be lazy," he snapped. "That's child abuse." The light turned green. The car sped away. Maria felt Ethan's small hand slip into hers. She squeezed it gently. "Don't listen to that," she whispered. Ethan nodded. Though the hurt still lingered in his eyes, cruelty came in many forms. Sometimes it came from strangers who shouted insults. Sometimes it came from people who looked straight through them as if they didn't exist. And sometimes it came from people who believed they were doing the right thing. One afternoon, two police officers approached them while they stood beside their usual corner. "Ma'am," one officer said firmly, "we've received complaints about you panhandling here." Maria's stomach tightened. "I'm sorry, officer," she said respectfully. "We're not causing trouble. We're just trying to get by." The officer sighed. "I understand, but you can't stay here today." Maria nodded quietly. "Of course." She gently touched Ethan's shoulder, and together they gathered their few belongings before walking down the block to find another spot. Neither of them complained, but Maria could feel the weight of the world pressing harder with each passing day. That evening, they returned to the alley behind the grocery store where they usually slept. The wind had grown colder, rattling loose metal along the building walls. Maria wrapped their thin blanket tighter around Ethan. "I'm sorry things are so hard right now," she murmured. Ethan looked up at her with a small smile. "It's okay." "M.O.M. How is it okay?" she asked softly. The boy thought for a moment before answering. "Because we still have each other." Maria felt tears sting her eyes, even in the darkest moments. Her son somehow found light. The next morning, they returned to their usual intersection, and like most mornings, cars rushed past them without stopping. Hours went by. A few people offered small donations. Others ignored them completely. But then something unexpected happened. A sleek silver SUV slowly approached. The red light. Maria recognized the vehicle. Instantly. It was Laura Whitmore. But something was different this time. Instead of simply rolling down her window as usual, Laura pulled her car over to the curb. Maria approached carefully, noticing that Laura's expression was unusually serious. "Good afternoon," Maria said gently. Laura offered a faint smile. "Hi." Maria. Beside her, in the passenger seat, sat Sophie, the cheerful 10-year-old girl who always waved to Ethan. But today, Sophie wasn't waving. She looked pale. Her small body seemed weaker than usual, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Ethan stepped closer to the car window. "Hi, Sophie," he said quietly. The little girl managed a soft wave, but her smile looked tired. Maria felt a sudden knot form in her chest. "Is everything all right?" she asked Laura. Laura hesitated for a moment. She seemed unsure whether to speak. Then she took a slow breath. "I might not be coming by this way for a while," she said. Maria frowned slightly. "Why?" Laura glanced at her daughter before answering. "Sophie has been very sick." The words immediately filled the air with tension. Maria's expression softened with concern. "I'm so sorry," she said. "What's wrong with her?" Laura didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the steering wheel, her hands tightening around it. "It's complicated," she said quietly. Maria could see the pain in the woman's eyes, and something inside her told her that whatever Laura was facing, it was serious. "If you don't mind sharing," Maria said gently. "Sometimes it helps to talk about it." Laura let out a long breath. Then she finally spoke. "Sophie has a heart condition," she said. Maria felt her chest tighten. "A heart condition?" Laura nodded. "The doctors say her heart is failing. She needs a transplant." Ethan's eyes widened. "A new heart?" he asked softly. Laura nodded. Again. "Yes." Maria struggled to find the right words. "That must be terrifying," she said. Laura's voice trembled slightly. "She's been on the transplant waiting list for months. Every day we wait hoping the hospital will call." She glanced at her daughter, who was quietly looking out the window. "Without a transplant," Laura whispered, "she might not survive." The words hung heavy in the air. Maria placed a hand over her heart. "I'll pray for her," she said sincerely. Laura gave a grateful smile. "Thank you." The traffic light turned green, and cars began honking behind her. "I have to go," Laura said quickly. "But thank you for listening." As the silver SUV drove away, Ethan remained staring at the road long after it disappeared. "M.O.M., he said quietly. "Yes?" I hope Sophie gets a new heart. Maria nodded slowly. So do I. Either of them could have imagined that just a few days later, fate would bring their lives together again in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Why do you think some people show cruelty to those who are struggling, while others show kindness? Do you think kindness is something people are born with or something they choose? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Share your answer in the comments. After that conversation with Laura Whitmore, something lingered in Maria Bennett's mind. The image of little Sophie sitting quietly in the passenger seat stayed with her long after the silver SUV disappeared into the busy traffic of Chicago for the first time since they had met the kind woman and her daughter. Maria felt a deep worry settle in her heart. A failing heart. A child waiting for a transplant. It was the kind of burden no parent should ever have to carry that evening. As Maria and Ethan returned to the alley behind the grocery store where they slept, Ethan seemed unusually quiet. Normally, he would talk about the funny things he saw during the day, the dog that chased pigeons near the bus stop, or the street musician who sometimes played guitar nearby. But tonight, he walked beside his mother in silence. When they finally sat down on their thin blanket, Maria gently nudged him. You're thinking about Sophie, aren't you? She asked softly. Ethan nodded. She looked really tired today. Maria wrapped an arm around him. Yes, she did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan said something that surprised her. Do you think she'll get a new heart? Maria looked up at the darkening sky. I hope so, she said quietly, but inside she knew how uncertain that hope really was. Hospitals had long waiting lists, and for every child waiting for a transplant, there were countless others hoping for the same miracle. The next morning, Maria and Ethan returned to their usual corner. As always, the city rushed around them, horns honking, buses roaring, people hurrying to work. But Ethan kept glancing down the road, waiting, watching, hoping to see the familiar silver SUV. It never came. Days passed, still no sign of Laura or Sophie. Yet even without seeing them, the small bond that had formed between the two families continued to grow in quiet ways. Sometimes Ethan would notice a child walking with their mother across the street and wonder if Sophie was doing the same somewhere else. Other times he would ask Maria questions. Do doctors fix hearts the same way they fix broken bones? Does it hurt when someone gets a transplant? Do people feel different with a new heart? Maria didn't always have the answers, but she admired the compassion behind her son's curiosity. Despite everything life had thrown at him, Ethan still cared deeply about others. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower behind the tall buildings of downtown Chicago, something unexpected happened. Maria and Ethan were sitting on the curb sharing a small bag of pretzels someone had given them earlier when a familiar vehicle slowly pulled up beside the intersection. The silver SUV. Ethan jumped to his feet instantly. MOM? It's them. Maria stood up quickly as Laura rolled down the window. But the moment Maria saw her face, she realized something was very wrong. Laura looked exhausted. Her eyes were red and swollen, as if she had been crying for hours. Hello, Maria, she said softly. Maria stepped closer to the car. How is Sophie? Laura glanced toward the passenger seat. Sophie was there, but she looked even weaker than before. Her skin was pale, and small medical tubes were taped near her arm. They let us come home for a little while, Laura explained quietly. The doctors say she needs to stay positive while we wait. Ethan walked up to the window slowly. Hi, Sophie. The girl looked up and managed a small smile. Hi, Ethan. Her voice sounded fragile. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a smooth stone he had found near the river a few weeks earlier. The surface was polished and shaped like a tiny heart. I found this, he said shyly. I thought you might like it. Sophie's eyes widened slightly. You're giving it to me? Ethan nodded. It's a lucky heart stone, he said with quiet confidence. Sophie held it carefully in her palm. Thank you, she whispered. Laura watched the moment unfold with emotion in her eyes. You didn't have to do that, she said gently. Ethan shrugged. I want you to. Laura reached into a bag on the passenger seat and handed Maria two sandwiches and a bottle of water. I wish I could do more, she said. You've already done a lot. Maria replied sincerely. There was a brief silence between them. Then Laura said something that made Maria's chest tighten. The doctor said we could get the core any day, or we might Never get it. Maria looked at Sophie again. The little girl sat quietly, holding the heart-shaped stone in both hands. We'll keep praying for her, Maria said softly. Laura nodded gratefully. Thank you, as the traffic light turned green. The silver SUV slowly pulled back into the road. Ethan waved as it drove away. Sophie lifted the small stone and waved back. Neither of them knew that the next time their lives crossed paths it would be inside a hospital under the harsh lights of an emergency room, and the kindness Ethan had shown in that small moment would soon become something far greater than anyone could imagine. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Do you believe small acts of kindness like Ethan giving Sophie that little heart-shaped stone can have a deeper meaning in someone's life? Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest impact. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The days that followed felt strangely quiet for Maria Bennett and her son Ethan. Life continued the way it always had, standing at the busy intersection in Chicago, greeting strangers and hoping for just enough kindness to get through another day. But something subtle had changed ever since Sophie Whitmore had taken the small heart-shaped stone from Ethan's hand. The boy carried a quiet hope inside him. Every morning, as the rush of cars filled the streets, Ethan would glance down the road, watching for the silver SUV. Sometimes he imagined Sophie sitting inside it, holding the stone tightly in her small palm. Do you think she still has it? He asked Maria one afternoon. Maria looked at him with a soft smile. I'm sure she does. She looked really happy when I gave it to her. That's because it meant something, Maria said gently. Ethan thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded. But even as small moments of hope filled their conversations, the world around them continued to remind them how fragile life could be. The weather had begun to shift. Cold winds moved through the streets of Chicago more often now, carrying the early signs of winter. Some nights the temperature dropped so low that Maria barely slept. She would wake up repeatedly, just to make sure Ethan was still warm beneath their thin blanket. On one particularly cold evening, they sat together near the side of the grocery store, sharing a small container of soup that someone from a nearby restaurant had given them. Ethan blew gently on the spoon before taking a sip. M.O.M. Yes. Do you think we'll ever have a home again? Maria felt the familiar ache in her chest. She wished she could promise him everything would be okay. But life had taught her that promises weren't always safe. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder. I believe things can change, she said quietly. Ethan looked thoughtful. Even for people like us. Maria smiled softly. Especially for people like us. The boy nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. But as the night grew darker, Maria found herself staring up at the cloudy sky. Somewhere out there, a little girl was waiting for a miracle, and somewhere else in the city, thousands of lives were moving forward without realizing how suddenly everything could change. A few days later, Maria and Ethan returned to their corner like always. The traffic was unusually heavy that afternoon. Construction trucks rumbled down the street, and impatient drivers honked their horns as they waited for the red light to change. Ethan stood near the curb, holding their cardboard sign while Maria spoke quietly with an elderly man who had stopped to give them a few dollars. Then something unexpected happened. A woman crossing the street suddenly tripped near the crosswalk. Her grocery bag spilled across the pavement, apples rolling toward the middle of the road. Before Maria could even react, Ethan rushed forward. Careful, he shouted. He quickly gathered the scattered fruit and handed it back to the woman just before the traffic light changed. Thank you, the woman said, breathless. Ethan smiled. No problem. Maria watched the moment with quiet pride, even when they had almost nothing. Her son never hesitated to help someone else. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower behind the tall buildings, the familiar silver SUV appeared once again. Ethan's face lit up instantly. It's Sophie. The car slowed to a stop at the light, but this time, Laura Whitmore didn't roll down the window immediately. Maria noticed that her expression looked more anxious than usual when the window finally lowered. Laura spoke quickly. We're on our way to the hospital. Maria felt her heart skip. What happened? Laura glanced toward Sophie in the passenger seat. The little girl looked pale again. The doctors called this morning, Laura explained. They want to run more tests. Ethan stepped closer to the car. Are you okay, Sophie? Sophie nodded weakly. I'm just tired, but even in her exhaustion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small stone Ethan had given her. I still have it, she said softly. Ethan smiled. I told you it was lucky. Laura's voice trembled slightly. I hope you're right. The traffic light changed, and cars behind them began honking. Laura looked at Maria. I'll let you know what happens, she said. Maria nodded. Drive safely. As the silver SUV disappeared down the street, Ethan turned back toward the sidewalk. MOM, he said quietly. Yes? I really hope she gets a new heart soon. Maria looked down at him. So do I, but fate had already begun weaving the threads of a story none of them could see that evening. As Maria and Ethan packed their few belongings to head back toward the alley where they slept, Ethan noticed something across the street. A small dog had wandered into traffic. Cars were swerving to avoid it. Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward. Hey, little guy, he called gently. The dog trotted nervously along the curb. Maria watched her son carefully. Be careful, she warned. Ethan nodded. I will. It was a simple moment, a small act of kindness. But sometimes these smallest moments are the ones that led to the biggest turning points. And just a few days later, on that same busy street corner in Chicago, a speeding car would run a red light. A life would hang in the balance, and a mother would face the most heartbreaking choice she had ever known. But before we reach that moment, I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment in life where everything seemed normal and then suddenly everything changed? Life can shift in a single second. Share your experience in the comments. The afternoon began like so many others. The wind moved gently between the tall buildings of Chicago, carrying the distant sounds of traffic, sirens, and hurried footsteps. Maria Bennett and her son Ethan stood at their usual corner near the intersection, their worn cardboard sign resting against the curb. It had been a quiet day. A few kind strangers had stopped to offer spare change. Someone from a nearby CF had handed them 2 warm bagels earlier that morning. For once, the day felt almost peaceful. Ethan leaned against the traffic pole, watching the cars pass. MOM, he said after a moment. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Sophie is still in the hospital? Maria looked out toward the road, thinking. I imagine she probably is, waiting for the new heart. Maria nodded softly. Yes. Ethan grew quiet. Then he said something that made Maria glance at him. I hope the doctors find one soon. She smiled gently. So do I. A red light stopped the long line of vehicles in front of them. Drivers checked their phones. Some stared straight ahead. Others tapped impatiently on their steering wheels. Ethan stepped forward, holding their sign where it could be seen. A few people rolled down their windows and dropped small coins into the cup he carried. Thank you, he said cheerfully each time. Then a woman in a blue sedan handed him a folded $5 bill. Ethan's eyes widened. Thank you so much, he said gratefully. He hurried back to Maria, his face glowing with excitement. Look, Emma. Maria smiled. That's wonderful. The traffic light changed again, and the cars began moving forward. For a few moments, everything felt normal, ordinary, but fate was already racing toward them faster than anyone realized. Across the intersection, a man driving a dark SUV was approaching the red light. He wasn't paying attention. His eyes were fixed on his phone. The traffic signal turned red. Cars ahead of him slowed, but the SUV didn't. Back on the corner, a gust of wind suddenly lifted Maria's cardboard sign and carried it toward the road. Oh, Maria exclaimed. The sign slid across the asphalt, stopping near the middle of the street. Without thinking, Ethan rushed forward. I'll grab it. Ethan, wait, Maria called, but the boy had already stepped into the crosswalk. The traffic light was red. The cars had stopped. He thought it was safe. Ethan bent down and picked up the cardboard sign, and that's when the sound came, a screech of tires. Maria turned just in time to see the dark SUV speeding toward the intersection. Too fast. Much too fast. Ethan, she screamed. The boy looked up for one frozen second. His eyes met his mother's. Then the impact came. The world seemed to explode with sound. The SUV slammed into Ethan, throwing his small body across the pavement. The vehicle never stopped. It sped through the intersection and disappeared down the street. For a moment, the entire intersection fell silent. Then chaos erupted. People shouted. Someone called 911. Mary ran into the street, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Ethan, Ethan. She dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands trembled as she lifted his head gently into her lap. Stay with me, sweetheart, she cried. Blood stained the pavement beneath him. Ethan's breathing was shallow. His eyes flickered open for a brief moment. MOM, he whispered weakly. I'm here. Maria said desperately. I'm right here. Tears streamed down her face. Don't leave me. Ethan, please don't leave me. Sirens echoed in the distance. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed forward, carefully lifting Ethan onto a stretcher. Severe trauma, one of them said urgently. We need to move now. Maria climbed into the ambulance beside her son, clutching his hand tightly as the vehicle sped through the streets of Chicago. The siren wailed loudly as they rushed toward the nearest hospital. Inside the ambulance, machines beeped urgently. Paramedics worked quickly, checking Ethan's pulse and oxygen levels. Maria could barely breathe. Please save him, she whispered over and over again. Please save my boy. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately rushed Ethan into the emergency room. Maria was left standing alone in the hallway, her hands shaking violently. Minutes passed, then an hour. Each second felt like a lifetime. Finally, a doctor walked toward her. His face was serious. Maria's heart dropped. Mrs. Bennett, he said gently, your son has suffered massive internal injuries. The words felt like knives. We're doing everything we can, the doctor continued, but the damage is very severe. Maria clutched the edge of a nearby chair to steady herself. Is he going to be okay? She whispered. The doctor hesitated. Then he spoke the words no mother is ever prepared to hear. I'm very sorry, but it's unlikely he will survive. Maria's knees buckled. The hallway seemed to spin around her. Her son, her sweet, kind, generous boy was dying, unbeknownst to Maria. Something else extraordinary was happening inside that same hospital at that very moment, just a few floors above. A little girl named Sophie Whitmore lay in a hospital bed, still waiting, still hoping, still needing a heart. But before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you had been standing there at that moment, watching everything unfold, what do you think you would have done? Would you have reacted the same way Maria did? Life can change in a single second. Share your thoughts in the comments. The hospital hallway felt colder than any winter Maria Bennett had ever known. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above her, casting a pale glow across the empty chairs lining the corridor. Nurses walked quietly back and forth, their voices hushed, their footsteps careful, but Maria heard none of it. All she could hear was the echo of the doctor's words, repeating in her mind, it's unlikely he will survive. Her son, her Ethan, the boy who had smiled at strangers even when they ignored him, the boy who shared food with people who had even less than he did, the boy who still believed kindness could change the world. Maria sat in a chair outside the intensive care unit, her hands shaking as she stared at the floor. Time had lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, a nurse approached her gently. Mrs. Bennett, she said softly, you can come see him. Maria stood on unsteady legs and followed the nurse into the room. Machines beeped quietly, monitors blinked, and lying in the hospital bed was Ethan. His small body looked so fragile beneath the white sheets. Bandages covered parts of his head and chest. Tubes and wires surrounded him, keeping track of every faint heartbeat. Maria walked slowly to the bedside, her breath caught in her throat. Ethan, she whispered. His eyelids fluttered weakly for a brief moment. His eyes opened. "Mom," he murmured. Maria grabbed his hand immediately. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said through her tears. "I'm right here." Ethan tried to smile. It was faint, but it was still there. "Did I drop the sign?" he asked weakly. Maria shook her head quickly. "No, honey. Everything's okay." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. A doctor quietly entered the room behind her. "Mrs. Bennett," he said gently, "may we speak outside for a moment?" Maria hesitated. She didn't want to leave Ethan, but she knew she had to hear what the doctor had to say. Reluctantly, she stepped into the hallway. The doctor closed the door softly behind them. "I'm very sorry," he said. "Your son's injuries are extremely severe." Maria's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" she asked. The doctor took a slow breath. "It means there's nothing more we can do to save him." The words felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Maria pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. "No," she whispered. "There has to be something." The doctor's voice remained gentle but firm. "His organs are beginning to shut down. It's only a matter of time." Tears streamed down Maria's face. The hallway blurred. Her chest felt like it was collapsing inward, and then through the overwhelming grief a memory suddenly flashed in her mind. A silver SUV, a small girl waving happily. From the passenger seat, Sophie Whitmore, the little girl who needed a heart transplant, Maria slowly looked up at the doctor. Her voice trembled as she asked a question that made the doctor pause. If my son isn't going to survive. Her lips quivered. Could his heart save someone else? The doctor blinked in surprise. You're asking about organ donation? Maria nodded slowly. There's a little girl here, she said. Sophie Whitmore. Recognition flickered across the doctor's face. Yes, she's one of our transplant patients. She needs a heart. Maria said softly. The doctor hesitated. We would need to run compatibility tests, he explained. A match like that is very rare. Maria wiped the tears from her cheeks. Please check. Hours passed. The hospital staff ran test after test. Maria sat silently in the hallway, praying harder than she ever had in her life. Finally, the doctor returned. His expression was one of quiet disbelief. Mrs. Bennett. Maria stood immediately. Yes? The doctor looked at her with deep respect. It's a match. Maria felt her heart stop. A match. The doctor nodded. Your son's heart is compatible with Sophie Whitmore. For a long moment, Maria didn't speak. The weight of the decision in front of her felt almost impossible to bear. To save another child, she would have to say goodbye to her own. She closed her eyes as tears streamed down her face. Then she whispered, something no parent should ever have to say. Let my son save her. The doctor nodded solemnly. We'll prepare for surgery immediately. Before they began, Maria asked for a few more minutes with Ethan. She returned to the room and sat beside his bed. The machines continued their steady rhythm. She gently brushed his hair away from his forehead. My sweet boy, she whispered. Ethan's eyes opened slightly. Mom? I need to tell you something, she said softly. He looked at her weakly. There's a little girl here, Sophie. Do you remember her? Ethan nodded faintly. The girl with the stone, he murmured. Maria squeezed his hand. She needs a new heart. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he whispered something that shattered Maria's heart and filled it with pride at the same time. Then she can have mine. Maria broke down in tears. I love you so much, she cried. I love you too. Mom, Ethan whispered. Moments later, doctors carefully prepared him for surgery. Down the hallway, in another operating room, Sophie Whitmore was being prepared for the transplant that might save her life. 2 families, 2 children. One unimaginable sacrifice. But before we continue, let me ask you something. Do you believe Ethan's decision was the greatest act of kindness a person could ever give? Or do you think no parent should ever have to make a choice like Maria did? I would really love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. The hospital corridors were filled with a tense, fragile silence. In 2 different operating rooms inside a major hospital in Chicago, 2 surgical teams prepared for procedures that would change lives forever. One room carried the unbearable weight of loss. The other carried the fragile hope of survival. Maria Bennett sat alone in a quiet waiting area outside the surgical wing. The chair beneath her felt stiff and unfamiliar, but she barely noticed. Her hands were clasped tightly together. Her head bowed as she whispered silent prayers. Just hours earlier, she had been holding her son's hand. Now, surgeons were preparing to remove his heart. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime. Across the hall, in another waiting room, Laura Whitmore paced nervously back and forth. Her daughter Sophie had been rushed into surgery after doctors informed her that a compatible heart had been found. Laura could hardly believe it. For months, she had lived with the constant fear that the call would never come. But somehow, against all odds, a donor had appeared. She didn't know who it was. She didn't know where the heart had come from. All she knew was that someone, somewhere, had given Sophie a chance to live. The surgery began. Inside the operating room, doctors worked with precise focus. Machines hummed steadily as surgeons carefully performed the delicate procedure that could determine the future of a young girl's life. Hours passed slowly. Maria sat quietly, staring at the floor as memories of Ethan flooded her mind. She remembered the first time he learned to ride a bicycle. The way he used to laugh when pigeons scattered across the sidewalk. The way he always said thank you to every person who offered them help, even when life had been cruel to him. Ethan had never stopped believing in kindness, and now his final act of kindness was unfolding behind those operating room doors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor stepped out into the hallway. Maria stood immediately. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. Mrs. Bennett, the doctor said gently. Maria could barely speak. How did it go? The doctor offered a soft, respectful smile. The transplant was successful. Maria covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Her body accepted Ethan's heart. The doctor continued. It's beating strongly for a moment. Maria couldn't breathe. Her son was gone, but his heart was still alive, beating, saving another child at that very moment. Laura Whitmore was also receiving the same news. When the doctor told her Sophie's surgery had been successful, she collapsed into tears of relief. Thank God, she cried. Thank God, but she still had no idea whose heart had saved her daughter's life. Meanwhile, Maria quietly returned to the small hospital chapel. The room was dimly lit, filled with soft silence. She sat alone in the front row and allowed herself to cry fully for the first time, not just for the loss of her son, but for the overwhelming mixture of grief and pride that filled her heart. Ethan had always been a kind boy, even when he had almost nothing. He had still chosen to give, and now, in the most unimaginable way, he had given everything. Hours later, Laura Whitmore finally stepped into Sophie's recovery room. The little girl lay peacefully in the hospital bed, surrounded by soft beeping monitors. Her chest rose and fell slowly as she slept. Laura approached cautiously, afraid to believe the miracle was real. Then she noticed something resting on the small bedside table. A familiar object, the smooth heart-shaped stone Ethan had given Sophie days earlier. Laura gently picked it up. Sophie stirred slightly and opened her eyes. "M.O.M.?" she whispered. Laura rushed to her side. "I'm here." "Sweetheart." Sophie placed her hand over her chest. "My heart feels different." Laura brushed her hair gently. "That's because you have a strong new heart now." Sophie smiled faintly. "Do you think the boy who gave me the stone would be happy?" Laura hesitated, unsure what to say. "Yes," she said softly, "I think he would." But neither of them knew the full truth. They didn't know that the boy who had given Sophie that small heart-shaped stone had also given her the real one beating inside her chest, a gift more powerful than words, a sacrifice that would soon touch the hearts of people across the entire nation. But before we move forward, let me ask you something. You believe acts of kindness like Ethan's can inspire others to become better people? Sometimes one selfless act can ripple through the world in ways we never expect. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. For several days after the surgery, life inside the hospital moved quietly. Doctors checked Sophie Whitmore's vital signs around the clock. Nurses adjusted her medications and carefully monitored how her body responded to the new heart beating inside her chest. And with each passing hour, the news grew more hopeful. The transplant had not only been successful, it was extraordinary. Sophie's recovery was progressing faster than anyone had expected. Inside her hospital room in Chicago, sunlight filtered through the tall windows as she slowly regained her strength. Each day, she was able to sit up a little longer, breathe a little easier, and smile a little wider. But while Sophie's life was beginning, again another life had quietly come to an end. Maria Bennett had spent the last few days in a small temporary room provided by the hospital. She had no home to return to. No family nearby, and now no son. The nurses who had cared for Ethan treated Maria with incredible compassion. They checked on her often, bringing warm meals and sitting with her when the silence became too heavy. One nurse in particular, Emily Carter, could not stop thinking about the story she had witnessed. A homeless mother, a dying boy, and a decision so selfless, it seemed almost unbelievable. Late one evening, Emily shared the story with a friend who worked as a local reporter. At first, the journalist thought it sounded too extraordinary to be real, but when she contacted the hospital and confirmed the details, she realized something powerful had happened. Within days, a small article appeared in a local Chicago newspaper. The headline read, "Homeless Mother Donates Dying Son's Heart to Save Child Waiting for Transplant." The story spread quickly. Readers across the city were deeply moved by the incredible sacrifice Maria had made. Soon, local television stations picked up the story. News reporters began telling the emotional tale of a 13-year-old boy named Ethan Bennett who had lost his life in a tragic accident yet saved another child through the ultimate act of kindness. The response from the public was overwhelming. Messages of support began pouring in from across the country. Strangers wrote letters expressing their sympathy and admiration for Maria's courage. Donations began arriving as Well, small amounts at first, $10, $20, sometimes just 5, but they kept coming. People who had never met Maria Bennett felt compelled to help the woman who had given the world such a powerful example of love and sacrifice. Soon charities began reaching out, organizations that supported homeless families offered assistance, medical foundations praised the life-saving decision that had given Sophie a second chance, and then the story reached national news. Television anchors across the country spoke about Ethan Bennett, the boy who had once stood on a street corner with his mother, asking strangers for help. Now the world was learning about the kindness he had shown throughout his short life. People heard about how he shared food with other homeless individuals, how he smiled at strangers who ignored him, how he had given a little girl a heart-shaped stone just days before she received the heart that would save her life. The story touched millions. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, Laura Whitmore was finally told the identity of the donor whose heart had saved her daughter when the doctor gently explained that the heart belonged to Ethan Bennett, the boy Sophie had met on the street corner. Laura covered her mouth in shock. Tears filled her eyes. That boy, she whispered, the one who gave Sophie the stone. The doctor nodded quietly. Laura broke down crying. The weight of the sacrifice suddenly became painfully real. A young boy who had almost nothing had given her daughter the greatest gift imaginable. Later that evening, Laura sat beside Sophie's bed and held her hand. There's something I need to tell you, she said softly. Sophie looked up curiously. What is it? Laura took a deep breath. The heart that saved your life. She paused, her voice trembling. It belonged to Ethan. Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief. The boy from the street? Laura nodded slowly. Sophie placed her hand over her chest. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then a tear rolled down her cheek. He saved me, she whispered. Outside the hospital walls, the story of Ethan Bennett continued spreading across the nation, and what happened next would ensure that his kindness and his name would never be forgotten. But before we reach the final chapter of this story, let me ask you something. Do you think stories like Ethan's can change the way society sees homeless people and those who are struggling? Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones the world overlooks. Share your thoughts in the comments. Chicago winters are known for their cold winds, but that year something else filled the air across the city, something warmer. Hope. Just weeks after the story broke across national news, people everywhere were still talking about the homeless boy whose final act of love saved a child's life. 13-year-old Ethan Bennett, the boy who once sat quietly on a cold sidewalk beside a cardboard sign, had unknowingly touched the hearts of millions. But for Maria Bennett, the world still felt strangely quiet. The hospital room that had once been filled with machines, doctors, and urgent whispers now felt empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater near the window. Maria sat there holding Ethan's small, worn backpack. Inside were the simple things he carried every day: a crumpled notebook, a dull pencil, and a folded drawing Ethan had made weeks earlier. It showed a small house with a tree outside and 2 stick figures standing beside it, one tall, one small. Above it, Ethan had written in shaky letters, "Our future home." Maria pressed the paper to her chest and cried softly. But outside that hospital room, something extraordinary was happening. The story had spread faster than anyone expected. Television stations replayed the footage of Maria describing her decision through tears. Newspapers printed Ethan's photo on their front pages. Online, millions of people shared the story of the homeless boy whose heart now beat inside a little girl. And the response from the world was overwhelming. Donations began pouring in from strangers across the country. Children emptied their piggy banks. Families mailed letters filled with encouragement. Local businesses offered help. Churches organized charity drives. People who had never met Maria Bennett suddenly felt connected to her pain and inspired by her courage. Within a month, the city of Chicago stepped forward with life-changing news. Through a partnership between several charities and local housing organizations, Maria was offered a small apartment of her own. For the first time in years, she would have a warm bed, a roof, a kitchen, a door she could close at night. When Maria walked into the apartment for the first time, she stood silently in the middle of the living room. The walls were plain, the space was simple, but to her, it felt like a palace. She whispered softly into the quiet room, "Ethan, we finally made it home." But Ethan's story wasn't finished yet, not even close. Months later, Laura Whitmore reached out to Maria. With a trembling voice, Sophie wants to meet you, she said gently. Maria's heart raced. The hospital arranged the meeting carefully. It happened in a quiet garden behind the building where Sophie had spent so many weeks recovering. When Maria arrived, she saw a small girl standing beside Laura. Sophie looked healthier now, stronger, but there was something about the way she placed her hand over her chest that made Maria's breath catch. Slowly, Sophie walked forward, then she stopped just inches away from Maria for a moment. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Sophie whispered something that made tears fall instantly from Maria's eyes. "Thank you, for my heart." Maria knelt down and wrapped the little girl in a gentle hug, and as Sophie leaned against her, Maria heard it. A heartbeat, strong, steady, alive. Ethan's heart, beating on, not just inside Sophie, but inside every life his story had touched. Soon after, Laura Whitmore announced something that would ensure Ethan's kindness would never be forgotten. With support from donors and volunteers across the country, a new charity was created, the Ethan Bennett Foundation. Its mission was simple but powerful: to help homeless families find shelter, to support children waiting for life-saving transplants, and to remind the world that kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Every year after that, the foundation helped hundreds of families. Every year, Ethan's story continued to inspire people to look at strangers differently, because sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the richest, the most powerful, or the most famous. Sometimes they're just a quiet boy sitting on a sidewalk with the biggest heart in the world. This story leaves us with a powerful question. Ethan Bennett had almost nothing in this world. No home, no wealth, no security. Yet in the end, he gave something greater than most people ever will: a chance for someone else to live. And because of that one act of love, countless lives were changed forever. So now, we want to ask you something. What part of Ethan's story touched your heart the most? Was it the way he shared food even when he was hungry? The unimaginable courage Maria showed in her darkest moment? Or the incredible moment when Sophie whispered, "Thank you for my heart"? Do you believe one act of kindness, just one, can truly change the world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your voice matters in conversations like this. And if Ethan's story moved you, consider sharing this video so more people can hear it. Because sometimes a single story can remind the world what humanity is capable of.